Hey folks, welcome to video 4. This video is going to be a little more lengthy and a touch more involved, but we are going to actually get into a bit more complex operations, and we are going to adhere to a bit better practices. Right, in the past few videos, we've had a few things done here and there that wasn't necessarily anything egregious, but if you were to have a code review, somebody would be kind of upset with you. So we're going to do a little better in this tutorial, and we're actually going to have an in-memory database. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So much like the last few videos we've done, we're going to create a directory to store all of our code. Then we're going to come over to IntelliJ. We are going to go open. We are going to open up said repository, directory, whatever you want to call it. And then off to the races we go. We are going to create a new module. We are going to call this demo4. We are going to call this com.coffeecode creatine .education demo4. JDK 14, Java 11, packaged as a jar using Maven. Spring Boot 270, and we are going to create. Okay, there we go. We're going to shrink Maven over to the side, and we are going to expand out our packages. Right, so we have demo application 4, and then we have our Palm. Now, inside of our Palm, there are two things, or I guess a handful of things that we are going to need for this project. So first things first, we're going to need Spring Boot Web. So let's go ahead and get that added in. So this is going to be org.springframework.boot. And then we need Spring Framework Starter Web. And we're going to ditch the version. Alright, so just by way of notes, Spring Boot Web for server. Now, we are going to need database goodies. Now, in order for this database to work, we are going to need a few things. We are going to need JPA from Spring Framework. We're going to need JavaX persistence, and then we're going to need H2, which is the database itself. So let's go ahead and get those added. Dependency, the first one we are going to tack in there is JavaX. So JavaX dot persistence. Ooh, no. All right, go try and help. Okay, JavaX persistence. This is going to be JavaX dot persistence API, and then the version, I want to say we're on 2.2, right? And then we are also going to need data JPA from Spring Boot. So let's go org.springframework.boot, and then here this is going to be Spring Boot starter. Oh, what the hell is it? Data, we're not using Cassandra, we're just using JPA today. Right? So that should be that, and that should be 2.7.0. We really don't need this version because we have a Spring Boot version. So then, for our last dependency, we actually legitimately need H2, and that's going to be the in-memory database that we're going to be using. So com H2 database. This is going to just be H2 as the artifact, and then our version is going to be 2.1.212, I believe. Alright, and that should actually take care of all our dependencies. So, let's go ahead and refresh Maven here, and off to the races we will go. Alright, now, let's come back over here to our main class. We don't need our POM file open anymore. We don't need our help file open anymore. So let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to build. So, do we have a README? We don't. Let's go ahead and make one. New file readme.md. Alright. Boink. Okay, so what we're going to need is if we want to have things, and by things I mean CRUD operations that can touch a database, we're going to want to do a few things. We're going to want to be able to add. So let's say like create a thing, right? We might want to update a thing. We might want to get a thing, right? And then we might want to delete a thing. We'll figure out what this thing is later, so don't worry too much about that. The point to drive home here is we are making a lot of changes on this proverbial thing. And in order to create a thing, we just need some data. So let's say we're going to make it like a to-do list or something, right? Maybe we have like a name where we say like, I don't know, go get coffee, right? And then we can have a description. If y'all haven't figured this out yet, I suck at spelling. And maybe we need to like go to the store to get coffee, or maybe the coffee's really hot. We want to be careful, right? But we can have a description. So like go get coffee, need beans from the store or something. You get the idea, right? So then whenever we update this thing, right, or I should say whenever we create this thing is going to get created, it's going to be put in a database, and it's going to have an associated ID. This ID is how we find the thing, right? Whenever we update the thing, obviously we're going to want to pass in new data, right? But we are going to need a way to identify this thing, which means we need the ID, right? And so sure, we could get the thing and say, you know, hey server, give me the thing with ID ... right? On the same note, we could say delete the thing with ID ... but we need a way to get the thing's ID. So a lot of the times what you will see in backend servers is something that will get a bunch of things, right? It'll list them out. And so kind of the way this works is this create a thing becomes a post call with a payload. This update a thing becomes a post call again, or I'm sorry, a put, not a post, a put with a payload and a path variable of the ID. You'll have the get with a path variable with the ID, and then you'll have a get with no path variable. It'll just pull back everything you have access to. And then this delete will be a delete, again, with path variable. So that's kind of what we're going to build. So if we're going to make a to-do list, let's call the thing in the to-do list an item, I guess. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's create a package called item. Forgetting my naming conventions in Java. Lowercase item. All right. First things first, we are going to need a item class. Let's go ahead and build that out. And so this item, what did we decide? It was going to have a name and some details. And then the other thing to note is because this item is going to be something that lives inside of our database, we can use a handful of annotations to basically tell H2, hey, this is what's going to be in your database. So we can label this item as a database entity, then we can create a repository that links to that entity, and that is what is going to allow us to touch our database. And then the controller is actually what's going to expose it to the web server itself. So let's go ahead and get started with it. And let's get some of the easy stuff out of the way first. So inside of our class, we are going to have a name, right? And we're also going to need details, right? So far so good. We are also going to want to have both our constructors, an empty and a qualified. So let's say public item, here's our empty constructor. And then here will be our qualified instructor, right? This dot equals new string. All right. What did I do? Details. Sorry. See, no one's perfect at coding. All right. So then we have details. We are going to want our getters and setters. We're also going to add in a bit of just Java niceties. So whenever you create classes, technically you should have an equals, a hash code, and a toString. I haven't been putting those in our small baby classes in the first few modules. We're going to go ahead and add them in this one, but we'll get to that in a second. The important thing, or the interesting part about entities in databases, is for this particular class, we went over the distinction that we are going to need some type of ID, right? So what we can do in order to have an ID inside of our item is we can go private annotation ID, right? And then we can go generated long ID. And what this is going to do for us is it is going to use our Java as well as our persistence to create us these IDs that we will need. Now, in order to be able to leverage these IDs, we need to annotate our class as an entity. And that is what is going to allow Spring Boot to wire up a lot of niceties as far as database usage goes. Now, I've got something. Oh, this needs to be generated value, not generated. And we'll go ahead and import that. All right, so we have our item, which is an entity class, and as our generated ID value. And then it will have our string and our name. So now we just need all of basically the boilerplate code. So we can go ahead and generate getters and setters, piece of cake. And then we'll go ahead and hammer out our toString, our hash code, and our equals, right? Just because at this point we're having complex objects, we need to have an equals that will actually work for it. So override public boolean equals object O, not 0. And then inside of this, we go something to the effect, if this equals object, why do I keep on hitting 0? Jeez. Object, return true, if not object instance of, and this needs to be item, return false. And again, y'all don't necessarily have to worry about this sort of stuff if you are unfamiliar with it. Again, the purpose of this lesson is to go over some of the database stuff. So, if this seems foreign to you, I would definitely do a little bit of Googling on, I guess, creating classes, your equals, hash codes, and toStrings method. But other than that, I wouldn't worry too much about this. This.id, item.id, and then we need object. What's objects? Sorry. objects dot equals this dot name, and then it is item dot name, and then we need to go and objects dot equals, and then we need this dot details item dot details, and I think that's basically going to be it. We need our Java utils objects class. This needs to be objects, that needs to be equals, and then that should take care of that piece. Alright, and we need to override our public int hash code. This is going to return objects.hash, this.id, this.name, this.details. This needs to be a hash, and then we go override again, and then we need a public string to string, and then we need to return our item as a string. And this is going to be a bit of a pain to type out. This is going to be item, open brace, quote, plus id equals plus this dot id plus comma space name equals single quote plus this dot name plus escape single, oh my god, that's the wrong type of slash, link, okay, plus quote details, oh my god, equals single quote, big quote, plus this dot details plus single, and then this needs a semicolon. Alright, did I do that correctly? So we have item plus ID plus this dot ID. I think that's okay. Alright, so here's our item class. Nothing too crazy there. The only things to take away is we annotated as an entity and we have a generated ID. So, next thing we are going to need is a repository to talk to our database and leverage our entities. So let's go ahead and create an item repository class. Alright, and so the item repository is technically going to be an interface. And this interface is going to extend JPA repository. We're going to have an item is our value and our long is our ID, extends JPA repository. And that's realistically all you need for your repository. And then we are going to go ahead and create our controller. We're going to go item, Java class, item controller. Alright. Now that we have our controller, much like all our other ones, we need our REST controller annotation, and then we need to give our controller our repository. So we're going to go private final item repository is repository, and we are going to go item controller, right? Item repository, right? We are just creating a constructor for our item controller, and this is going to get the repository passed in, right? So now our item controller can actually leverage that repository. Now, let's talk about those endpoints that we had discussed earlier. Now, this is going to get a little gross because my IDE here is going to try and tell me I'm making some mistakes, but just bear with me. So we had the notion of a get items, right? We wanted something that's going to return everything. We wanted a get call that allows us to get a singular item that allows us to pass in an ID, right? We want a post mapping, right, that allows us to add an item. We wanted a put mapping that will allow us to update an item, right? And again, we want to be able to pass in our ID here. And then we want a delete mapping that will allow us to delete an item. And again, we'll need to pass in an ID for this one. We'll go capitals. Do we want capital IDs or lowercase IDs? Let's stay consistent with lowercase IDs. You don't capitalize variable names. Okay, so now we have all of our mappings. Let's go ahead and import our post mapping, and then we can start on our methods. So this get mapping, we will need it to return a list of items. All right, so we'll say list of items. Go ahead and import list. We will call this get items, right? That makes sense. And then what this is going to do is it is going to return basically everything that we can pull out of our repository. So repository has a find all. That gets us everything we need. Easy enough. All right. So then for our get mapping, whenever we pass in an ID, we need to just return a singular item. Now, the question that we then need to ask is what happens in the event we try to find an ID and it's not there? In theory, we should probably throw an exception. We could return, or our service should throw an exception, and then we can handle that exception however we want. We could also have it be the case that our service throws a 404, right, which is effectively resource not found, indicating to our client that we couldn't find the item. So we're going to go ahead and do something like that. We're going to throw an exception, and then we're going to have an exception handler, or advice as Spring Boot likes to call it, and that will handle bubbling up the 404. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to have an item be returned. We'll call this get item, right? Singular as opposed to plural. We need to pass in that path variable that we have inside of our URI. That is going to be an ID, right? And then we're going to come down here and we need to do a search. So we are going to return repository find by ID, right? We are then going to pass in the ID from the path variable, and then we are going to call or else throw, right? This or else throw, we are going to have a method call inside of this where we then throw the item not found exception, or an item not found exception, I should say. And I guess we'll go ahead and pass in the ID to it, right? And so what this will do is whenever we can't find the item, we throw this exception. And so now we need two things. We need this exception A to exist, and we actually need the exception handler itself. So let's go ahead and go build that out. So we'll tackle the item not found exception first. We will come over here to our items. We will go Java class. We will go item not found yet exception. And this class really isn't going to do anything too super fancy. This is just going to extend runtime exception. And then inside of this, we will have an item not found exception, in which case we'll pass in that ID. We're just making a constructor at this point. And then this is going to call super, and this will have just a message of could not find item plus the ID. So all this is doing is whenever we call item not found exception with the long ID, we will end up leveraging just runtime exception, right, using its constructor. So nothing terribly fancy going on here. Now, whenever this exception gets thrown, we need to have something to catch that exception and handle it. In the world of Spring Boot, we have something called controller advice, and we can take effectively a controller advice class, much like a REST controller, annotate some methods to basically say, in the event this type of exception is thrown, you operate as the exception handler. And so how we do that is we're going to make a new Java class. This is going to be item not found advice. We will need to annotate this as controller advice. And then inside of this, we will have a string. What are we going to call this? Item not found handler. This will be item not found exception. And then in here, we will just return e.getMessage. All right, now we need a couple annotations here. We are going to need a response body. We are also going to need exception handler, and we need to tell it what exception it's going to be handling. So this is going to be our item not found class. And then we need our response status. And then this is going to return a 404, right? And that should handle, all right, item not found advice. So at this point, inside of our controller, we have two endpoints, one of which gets items, one of which gets an item. So if we were to go ahead and run this, let's do so just for fun. Everything should link up and load. Cool stuff. We can come over here and we can do localhost 8080 get items. Now, whenever we call get items, there's nothing in our database, so we should get an empty list back. Right? Now, in the event we go localhost 8080 get item, and let's say we give an ID of 123, this will give us back a 404, right? Because we're trying to fetch something that does not exist. So here's our 404, there's our message. So, before we get, I guess, too fancy and start creating posts, let's go ahead and make something that will generate a few things for us. Bootstrap our database, if you will. So we'll go new Java class, and we're going to call this like load database. Right, and inside of this is going to be some configuration, not configurable. Configuration. Oh my god, this just tells Spring Boot that these are some configuration files, and there's not much more to it than that, right? So earlier, up until this point, we've been having a tendency to just use system.outs to print stuff. So let's actually use a logger at this point. So private static final logger log equals logger factory, and we want to go get logger, and then we want the logger for this class in itself, right? And this logger that we are going to use is going to be SLF for J. So let's go ahead and import and Java util, I don't think that's exactly what I want. Let's just grab it ourselves. Import org.slf and it should just be logger, if memory serves. There we go. All right. So we're going to make a bean. This is going to be a command line runner. So let's go ahead and create that. And then this bean is just going to be responsible for running this operation as soon as the database comes up. So we're going to call this command line runner. We're going to call this init database. This is going to be item repository, right? We need to pass in the repo that gives us a handle to the database. And then we're just gonna, this command line runner is realistically just gonna print some stuff out for us, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna have it return method invocations. So return args arrow, and we're gonna go log.info, and then we'll just say bootstrapping db plus, and then I need to go repository dot save, right? We're going to say new item, and we need to import my item class. Yep. And then we need to give it our name and our details. So one thing is going to be get coffee, details, be careful not to burn yourself. And then we're going to add another one just for giggles. So log.info bootstrapping db plus repository, right? Same sort of thing. Item, we're going to say take a shower. Be sure to bring soap. I don't know, I'm making this up. All right, and then we need a semicolon here. So this will bootstrap our database with some actual data in it, and then we'll be able to run those operations that we just kind of demoed. So we'll start up our server. All right, there we go. And as you can see, we said bootstrapping db item, right? So those are there. And now if we go to get items, hit send, right, we will have our items being listed out. And then if we wanted to use like 2 as an ID, right, we'll actually get the item back. All right, cool. So now we can go build out our other controllers. Let's go ahead and do that. So we can knock these out real quick. Blink. Okay, post mapping. This is going to be our create, so we're going to want to get a handle to the item back. We're going to say add item, and then this is going to need a request body, and this is going to be an item, and then in here, what we're going to do is return repository.save item, right? Going to pass in the item, going to save it in the repository. I do not understand why you are upset. Not applicable to parameter. That's a new one. Request, sorry. This needs to be request body, not response body. Staring at request response is too long. Okay, so the put mapping is going to be a little gnarly, so let's go ahead and knock out the delete mapping. That one will be super straightforward. All right, so this one, we don't need to return anything because we are actually deleting an item. So we'll say void delete item. We're using a path variable here. So this is an ID, which is a long. And then all we need to do here is repository dot delete by ID, and we'll pass in the ID. So that'll allow us to delete. Okay, so now let's talk about this put mapping. we're going to follow the similar pattern of basically just returning function invocations to make things a little easier. But this put mapping is going to look something like this. So first things first, we're going to want to return the item. We'll call this input or update item. This is going to be a path variable. We are going to use the ID as a long, and so that is the method itself. And so then we're going to go return repository dot, we need to find by the ID, right? The ID obviously needs to be passed in. And then from here, we are going to want to map. What is this going to be? Item. We are going to pass the item into this here method, and we are going to go item dot set name, and this needs to be item dot get name, and then item dot set details, item dot get details. All right, so we will do that, and then we need to, I want to say save, so let's go return. This is going to be repository dot save, and we want item, not e. Okay, and then from here, we are going to need our or else get. There we go, and we want to pass nothing in there. We just want a method, and then this is going to be item dot set ID, and then this is going to be return repository dot save item, and I believe this should get us close. What did I miss? Oh, our update item needs to have a path variable in it, but it also needs to have the request body. So this request body, item, there we go. All right. And then we're gonna have overlapping names. That's lovely. We'll call this item 2, I guess. Item 2. All right, so kind of the way this is gonna work is we pass in our request body for the item, and we pass in our path variable. We try to find the item by the ID, right, that already exists. We are going to map that. So we are passing in the data that we have as item 2. We're going to go item 2 dot set name, right? So the item 2 is a really awful name for this. But effectively what's going to happen is the new item, we are going to set the data from the body that we passed in, right? And then we're going to return it and save it. In the event we can't find it, we're effectively going to be creating the information and saving it. And so whenever we try to update, we either update an entry we have, or we fail and effectively create the new entry. And so that should take care of those 3 APIs. So let's go ahead and run this and make sure everything is working as anticipated. All right, we bootstrapped. So let's come over here just to make sure our items got bootstrapped. They did. Cool stuff. All right, so now let's go ahead and create a new item. Localhost 880. What do we call it? Add item. Add item. This needs to be a post. We will need a body. Raw JSON. Alright, and this will be our name. And we have details. Name will be, I don't know, get more tea. Details, it's hot outside, stay hydrated. Okay, so we will send that in. That became ID 3, we got more tea, it's hot outside. If we come back over here and we call get items, it shows up as we would expect. Let's go ahead and update this. So let's go localhost 8080 update item 3. Body will go JSON. So we have name, and we will have details. Details will change this to tea is delicious. And what did we call this? Get more tea. Let me just keep that the same for now. Get more tea. Alright. So then if we execute this, this needs to be a put. 405 method not allowed. That's because I ran a get on a put. Alright, so it's interesting. ID 4 get more tea. That actually looks like we created a new entry. Okay, that's fun. So our put didn't actually update. Let's figure out why that is the case. So whenever we were in our put mapping, we would have updated the item at ID 3, and it would have been ID 3. So let's see what I messed up. We would have found by ID. We would have that. See, this leads me to believe we didn't get my find by. Why is that the case? That is very curious. Oh, that's why. This needs to be item 2. Right, so we're just saving what we passed in. Right. Alright. Let's go ahead and rename this to make this a little more clear. So we are updating the item. We're going to refactor item 2 to database item. Right. So what we do is we pull the database item, or we get the item from the database, we set the name and the details based on the item that we passed in, and then we save the database item. Right. That is our error here. So let's go ahead and rerun this. Okay. And we'll come over here, and just because this is an in-memory database and it's not persisting anywhere, our database will be empty again. And then we can add our item, right, get more tea, which will show up. And then we should be able to update it, right, get more tea, tea is delicious, right, ID is 3. And then if we come over here, right, this should change to it's delicious. Perfect. All right, so now we can test out our delete. Localhost 8080, delete item 3, presto sendo. Again, 405 method not allowed. I'm going to get on a delete endpoint. Alright, got back a status 200. We didn't get any data back, as expected. And then if we come over here to list our IDs, item 3 is gone. So there you go. Nice little backend server with some items that we can get one of them, get all of them, add one, update one, or delete one. And with that, this concludes Demo 4.